Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Good morning. I'm Rabbi Jenny Greenspan here for Congregation Beth-El Zedek in Indianapolis for our weekly Shabbat morning Torah Talk. I say welcome. Give us a couple of moments to gather as we will be today talking about Torah portion Va'era. And God appeared, and He appeared. Which you can find a PDF, as usual, of our Etz Chaim Chumash by going to bez613.org and selecting under the worship menu, selecting the virtual Shabbat morning resources. Scroll down to where it says Torah Talk and Etz Chaim, and you can get a copy of this week's Torah portion if you'd like to follow along or read through it on your own. This one, like last week, contains a tremendous amount of narrative, a story that we are probably familiar with and that we can always find something a little bit deeper within. So I invite you to download that. We're only going to look at a couple of verses as usual here in our Torah Talk, but I do encourage to give it a read through and see what you may never have noticed before of this very familiar Passover story, or a story that we look through during Passover. And before we get started, I want to say Shabbat Shalom and good morning to Alex Binder, to Jim Roth, to Alan Hamburger, Phyllis Lugar, to the Seagulls, Shabbat Shalom, Cindy Harp, and Margot May. So good to see so many already joining this morning. And we will jump right in. Today I found a section that I think I may have looked at before a few times, and I think it just has an even deeper message for us this year with all that has happened to us in the last year. So I want to make sure I give us a good amount of time to think through it. But if you are following along in the Etz Chaim Chumash, I'll be focusing on a couple of verses that are pretty early on in the Torah portion. They will be on page 352 through 353. I'll be looking at Exodus chapter 6, verses 6 through 9. So if you want to follow along with those, we'll take a look. And Shabbat Shalom, and welcome to Carol Steinfeld and to Cheryl Toof. Glad you're joining us as well. So if you'd like to follow along, those are the pages that I will be working from primarily. But there's a lot in this Torah portion because, unfortunately, there's a lot of suffering in this Torah portion. There is the suffering of the Israelites in their slavery and in their bondage and in their hard work that has been made more extreme since the end of last week's Torah portion, since Pharaoh's first approach to Moses saying, "Let my people go," the first time, was to add more work. So the Israelites are suffering under tremendous amounts of work. And throughout this Torah portion, there will be tremendous amounts of suffering on the Egyptians' part, as well as the first 6 of the 10 plagues that we review at Passover all happen during this week's Torah portion. So there's a tremendous amount of suffering, and therefore I see in it at least 2 approaches to coping with suffering. The most obviously known is Pharaoh's. For Pharaoh, after each plague that he and his people face, he tries what some might call the easy approach. He says, this is the worst that it's going to be, and he hardens his heart. At first, Pharaoh hardens his heart. Later, God hardens Pharaoh's heart. It is almost as though it has become habit. Each plague, Pharaoh says, this is the worst that it will be. I'm going to harden my heart, and I will try to pretend that nothing more can happen. It will not get worse. It can't be that bad. And that is a self-protective measure. That is a measure to make sure that Pharaoh is taking care of himself and saying, if this is the worst that it's going to get, I'll be okay. The Egyptians may or may not have followed suit with him. But I think that many of us have tried that sort of approach at some time. It's kind of natural to try to protect our psyche in that way, to say, this is as bad as it's going to get. I'm going to harden my heart. It's not going to get worse. Until the next bad thing happens. We continue trying to repeat the same habit over and over again, as Pharaoh ends up doing a total of 10 times, which we'll see into next week's Torah portion, which means that there is even more suffering and even more loss on Pharaoh's and his people's part. And God instead tries to allude to a different method for coping with suffering that I want us to focus on a little bit more deeply in a moment. Because I want to address something that I think that for all of us, at least for many of us, we've been missing over the last year and have been robbed of since the spring of last year, is that we haven't been able to truly anticipate. We don't really know how to look forward anymore, because our ability to look forward to something, to anticipate something, to get excited about something, to hope for a brighter tomorrow, has been something that has been extremely difficult to do in the last 10 months of living through the COVID-19 pandemic. We don't have the ability to have a real expectation of days that we're looking forward to and expecting that they'll look pretty close to what we've imagined. In some ways, for me, I think that that's been the biggest plague of the last 11 months or so for many people's personal lives. It's not only the suffering of the disease itself, nor the suffering of the political divisiveness that we've been seeing. We've resulted in a sense of hopelessness, a sense that everything we've anticipated may or may not come to pass. A sense that the suffering we're finding ourselves experiencing is all that we're going to be experiencing from here on out. And there won't be really an end to that suffering. I think that's the kind of suffering that the Israelites in our portion are dealing with. And at the start of our portion this week, they seem to have that feeling. Moses comes to them and delivers the following message on God's behalf. This is the one on page 352 in the Etz Chaim, if you'd like to follow along, starting with verse 6. I am Adonai, Moses delivers from God. I will free you from the labors of the Egyptians and deliver you from their bondage. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and through extraordinary chastisements. I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God. You shall know that I, Adonai, am your God who freed you from the labors of the Egyptians. I will bring you to the land which I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I will give it to you as a possession, for I am Adonai. It's a grand message. It's everything you'd think you'd want to hear. We heard right now, all of this will be fine, it will be over. You think it's what they want to hear. Their God remembers them. There will be deliverance from their slavery and bondage. They will be rescued. There will be miracles done on their behalf. They will be free, and they will get to go home to the land of their ancestors. In short, their suffering will end. Everything will be fine. Everything will be safe. You'd think it's exactly what they should want to hear. And yet, the very next verse, take a look at verse 9. But when Moses told this to the Israelites, they could not listen to Moses, their spirits crushed by cruel bondage. So the word for their spirit crushed is kotzer ruach. As opposed to a hardened heart, they have a crushed spirit or a shortened spirit. Kates can mean like short, cut off, made small. Rashi suggests that it's their very breath has been cut off. They can't breathe deeply. They're always short of breath. And that affects their ability to cope. It's like they're hyperventilating with anxiety and suffering. And so they simply can't hear the message that God tried to deliver yet, because they feel crushed by everything that's happening to them. To me, at least, it feels familiar. How many of us have been in a situation that is so consuming it starts to feel inescapable? How many of us are feeling it right now, where we're still having to do virtual interaction and COVID cases are rising and political turmoil is rising? My own, as I described that summary, my own breath, I feel getting shorter. Their spirits crushed, their breath short. And so can we find it in ourselves to believe that it will get better, that we can get through this? Truthfully, not if we think it'll happen in just one day and one moment, nor if we harden our hearts and wait for that sort of moment. I don't have clear, perfect future knowledge any more than any other human being, but I am pretty sure we will not have a grand parting of the Red Sea, single moment, one day pandemic is rising, the next it is gone. I don't think that sort of event is happening, but truth be told, I don't think the Israelites really had that moment either. Their recovery in the wilderness was hard and they struggled a long time. The parting of the Red Sea was a moment in their journey, not the end of it. But what was the plan for getting through their suffering? It was actually slipped in at the very beginning. It was right there in that message they couldn't hear yet until they started to live it. Say therefore to the Israelite people, I am Adonai. I will bring you out from the labors of the Egyptians and rescue you from their bondage. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and through extraordinary chastisements, and I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God. So there are 4 major verbs there. If you know the Haggadah, you might have seen them before. The Hotzeti, Hitzalti, Ga'alti, Lakachti. I will bring you out. I will rescue you. I will redeem you. I will take you. Ramban, one of my favorite commentators, Rabbi Moses ben Nachman, who lived in Spain in the late 13th century, say that these are actually the steps in God's plan for redeeming the people and for ending their suffering. I think they can lay out a plan for healing from any suffering. First, I will bring you out. Ramban says means that God will physically take them out of Egypt. That happens, and that is not the end of their suffering. It's the start of it. The healing doesn't really get going until the crisis ends. If we're still feeling hurt right now, that's normal. We've only just begun the process of getting out as more and more vaccines are getting their way out and becoming available. The Israelites have months of Moses arguing with Pharaoh before they will get out when they first hear this message. And we have months to go before everyone receives the vaccines and the vaccines can achieve full efficacy for our population. And it will still remain scary to make plans and to look forward to things. The next verb, I will rescue you, Ramban says means the Egyptians won't have psychological sway over the Israelites anymore. And that's further away. How long will it take for us after the vaccines are out and everyone is vaccinated? Well, how long will it take before we don't feel a little bit cautious if we are nearer to someone that we don't know? Maybe in a store and someone is standing fewer than 6 feet away from us. Only time will tell. And it will take reminding ourselves what is and isn't safe again and readapting. I will redeem you, Ramban says, refers to the time when we don't even think of ourselves as slaves. They don't even think of themselves as slaves anymore. May that for us mean that someday we will again be able to hug without thinking twice. In the meantime, we can think about preparing for that. Who do we want to keep holding close emotionally? Who do we want to hold on to, send virtual hugs to remember who we are? Who will help us breathe so we don't remain in the kotzer ruach, shortened breath state? The final verb that is in this promise from God is I will take you. To take, one person or one entity taking another is the Torah's word for marriage. And for that reason, Ramban says that this is the one that will happen much later. It's not in the process of leaving Egypt. It's not even at the Red Sea. It's much later. It's when the Torah is given to them at Mount Sinai. The Torah itself is as though God is giving a ring in marriage to the Israelite people. And that, if we follow our calendar, is in our annual cycle, is 7 weeks after Passover. It's not the Exodus moment, but the Shavuot moment. It's 7 weeks later. And on our calendar, we count day by day, one day to the next, as we work through the physically out, psychologically out, emotionally out, one day at a time, before we actually reach that marriage point. And we count the Omer during that period of time. And so it's okay if we don't feel like we're there yet, because the vaccines have only just started to come out. They're not the Red Sea. It is not the Red Sea that ends the suffering, but rather the day by day work toward recovery and for healing. The process of getting out of our collective trauma has only just begun. We may still feel short of breath. We may still feel wary of anticipation, of letting ourselves hear that we will be safe. But I believe that we will be. I believe that in the meantime, we can count our days, we can reach out to one another, we can learn to breathe deeply and resist the temptation to let our hearts harden. So in the meantime, let's keep counting, we'll wait, and above all, Let us keep resisting the temptation to lose hope, and let us find our own breath. So say Shabbat Shalom. I see a welcome and Shabbat Shalom to Larry Spector, who joined, and to Jody Zucker and Julia Whitehead. So good to see so many people. And may we continue to help one another breathe and help one another find ends to the suffering and address the smallest ones as we can. And Shabbat Shalom to Brian Robinson. So good to see you all, and I hope you will join us on the live stream on bez613.org for our Shabbat morning service at 10 o'clock. And in the meantime, I am counting down the days, or counting up the days, since I don't know when it will end, till when I can see you again in person. Shabbat Shalom.